You're listening to The Authenticity Show, where you get to eavesdrop on great conversations about health, creativity, and the quest for excellence. Your hosts are Carlos Casados and Satch Purcell. Our guest today is Dr. Jeffrey Mishlove. Dr. Mishlove is the host and producer of the new Thinking Aloud channel on YouTube, featuring conversations on parapsychology, spirituality, philosophy, psychology, health, science, history, and culture. Between 1986 and 2002, he hosted and co-produced the original Thinking Aloud public television series. He's also the author of The Roots of Consciousness, Psi Development Systems, Thinking Aloud, and The PK Man. He happens to be the recipient of the only doctoral diploma in parapsychology ever awarded by an accredited university. It was from the University of California, Berkeley in 1980. He currently teaches parapsychology at the Holmes Institute for Ministers in Training with the Centers for Spiritual Living. So yeah, it's quite an impressive resume, and it goes on and on. Now, this was kind of a special interview for us because we actually flew out to Albuquerque, New Mexico to visit Dr. Mishlove at his home. He was so gracious, invited us in, made us tea. We sat down in his library, and the magic started flowing. And you can check us out on Facebook and Instagram for some great pictures. So here we go, Dr. Jeffrey Mishlove.
Well, you, as I've told you a couple of times, you are definitely one of my main influences for doing this show. Mm-hmm. Those early years of watching your show on PBS were really influential for me because you're studying the things that interest me.
Yeah.
You know, consciousness. I mean, I still have, it's in storage now, but your book, Roots of Consciousness, and it's just loaded with stuff all about psychic research and levels of consciousness and the brain. And so anyway, you're a huge influence for me.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that, you know, one of the things that we talk about on this show a lot is being open-minded skeptics. Mm-hmm. You know, and Carlos's joke is always that have an open mind, but not so open that your brains fall out.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that we try to do is be open to things, but also apply some critical thinking and some science, you know. And you're one of those individuals that does exactly that. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the reasons why we're excited to be able to have this conversation with you.
Well, you came a long way to be here and went to a lot of trouble to get here. So I'm delighted, and I'm happy to share with you as much as I can.
Beautiful. And for those who are listening right now, we're actually in, what would you call this, a library or a den?
It's a conference room and library.
Right. At Dr. Mishlove's home, which is like double honor for us to be able to be invited into your home. And I look around, and there are all these amazing examples of different traditions from around the world. So Dr. Mishlove has all these wonderful, there's scrolls and Torah and Buddha, and there's Kachina dolls and Tibetan mandalas and Egyptian hieroglyphic representations and Japanese kimono, and there's just so many things that like I could spend hours or if not days wandering just looking at everything here.
Yeah, there's a story behind each item.
Wow, there's got to be, right? I was going to say the other thing is we always record, usually we record in Oliver's living room, which is filled with books, and yet again we are recording in the presence of more books, which is perfect for us.
Yeah, home away from home. Mm-hmm. So could we just get right into the whole remote viewing thing? I just saw Third Eye Spies, and I know that you interviewed Russell Targ for the 8th time or something like that?
More than that,
yeah.
I suppose. Russell is actually one of my oldest and best friends.
Wow, that is so cool.
Mm-hmm.
So I really enjoyed the show. It included all the detail that I really wanted and craved. When I watched a movie, remember we watched Men Who Stare at Goats?
Yes.
And it was funny, but it was just lacking in any of the meat that really is interesting to me. But not this documentary. It was loaded with stuff. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to know from your standpoint, did you do research into remote viewing yourself?
Yes, I did. I even have a video interview, two of them, on the New Thinking Aloud channel, one with Russell and another one with Elizabeth Targ. Elizabeth Rauscher.
Okay.
Elizabeth Targ was Russell's daughter, now deceased. That's another interesting and long story. But Elizabeth Rauscher was a physicist who, when I first visited SRI, as I recall, in February of 1976, to have a remote viewing experience, Elizabeth was the outbound experimenter on that trial. And she remembered it vividly because it was a perfect trial to illustrate the principle of analytical overlay. The target is a well-known target. It's been shown in many books, a pedestrian overpass over Highway 101 in Menlo Park, California. And in my mind's eye, I thought I was seeing a rack of clothing in Macy's, and Russell was the monitor of my first remote viewing, and he said, "What do you see?" I said, "Well, I must be in Macy's. It looks like a rack of clothing." He says, No, stop that." He said, "I don't want you to interpret what you see at all. I want you to just describe the shapes and forms, the raw shapes and forms." And so I drew this picture, and I thought it was like hangers in a rack of clothing. But if you saw my picture and held it up next to a photograph of this pedestrian overpass, it was a perfect match.
Wow.
Oh my goodness! Wow.
So even to this day, some 40 years later, they still like to use that particular incident because it illustrates so well one of the pitfalls of remote viewing is to overinterpret what you're seeing.
So this is the thing that you're actually avoiding is the analytical overlay.
Yes, exactly.
Interesting.
Although a skilled remote viewer may see things very differently. I once attended a seminar with Joe McMoneagle talking about it, and he says, "Don't worry about analytical overlay." He says, "Just say whatever comes to mind." But he had so much experience.
Yeah.
That, he's able to approach it differently.
Good filters in place, basically.
Yeah.
But like for the listener, was the intention of that just sort of to get the conscious mind to not interfere with the sensory perceptions?
That's right. That's right. Because there's a natural tendency of the logical mind to want to get closure really quickly and to interpret.
Yes.
I mean, we do it automatically all the time because...
Jump the gun.
Yeah. I mean, a young baby, if you had an infant in this room here, they would be seeing patches of color and light. They wouldn't see it the way you see it. Here's bookcases, here's a kimono, here's a kachina doll. They would see it very differently. But our mind, we are instantly interpreting everything we see. And a good remote viewer learns how to turn that off so that they can just report things without any interpretation.
That's really cool. I can see that being extremely important because there's so much unconscious pattern recognition that we need to use in our life all the time.
Yeah.
One of my NLP teachers, he really emphasizes the difference between, creating meaning, the meaning-making aspect, versus what you're actually witnessing. So the sensory acuity can tell you, for example, is that person leaning in or are they leaning away? Is there tension? Are they relaxed? Those are sensory-based descriptions, but what you describe with meaning might be, oh, well, this person's feeling uncomfortable with what you just said, or this person is thinking about something. And you don't necessarily know that. But once you do know that, you can, in retrospect, see that pattern, that fit, as opposed to using the meaning making and interfering with your ability to interpret.
It's very similar, yeah.
It reminds me, we talk a lot about Buddhist concepts for mind, right? And it's the idea of the conditioned mind. So you have perception, right? What's I think is vijnana, right? You have perception, then sanya, recognition. And recognition is based upon your history, which you've interpreted. So it's almost like this idea of remove the recognition and just stick with the perception, the basic perception.
Especially in the beginning. when
Yeah.
you're first doing remote viewing. And of course, depending on the personality characteristics of the viewer.
Yeah.
But it also highlights the importance of what we call the monitor in remote viewing. Russell had an enormous track record, one of the most successful researchers in the history of parapsychology. And it has to do with his ability to be the monitor, which he mostly did. So he recognized instantly when I said, oh, this must be Macy's, that I was analyzing. And so he just instantly said, stop that. And go back and tell me actually what are the raw images.
It sounds also like his strong background of being a laser physicist that plays into the logic a little bit, because you have a source of energy like a light source going through a lens, and that lens is either going to focus or disperse or redirect that light beam, and information or let's say sensory data is going to come in, and there are ways in which you could probably blur the image versus allowing the image to make a full impression.
Well, another way in which his background as a laser physicist, I think, is important. And Russell is very unusual. If you ever got to meet him or know him, he has laser-like focus in his mind. You go into SRI International, well, in those days, that's where he worked, and you see this fellow 6'4", 6'5" tall, and he says to you, everybody does remote viewing here. And he says it with such focus that you can't doubt him.
Wow.
And at that point, it was like, of course I'm going to do it. Everybody does.
I enjoyed your interview, your recent interview with him, and I was so convinced by his conviction,
Yeah.
He's like that. Yeah.
He is totally convinced, and he's such a solid human being and so focused that it rubs off. Everybody around him seems to get that you can do this.
That's so cool. So you don't have to be someone who considers themselves gifted at psychic stuff per se. You can train to do remote viewing anyway.
Many remote viewers will tell you that people who are already consider themselves psychic are at a disadvantage. That a person who has never done it before, hasn't even had any psychic experiences at all, but is willing to learn the protocol and follow it from scratch and practice, has maybe a better chance of, if they have a little bit of native talent, than somebody who is skilled at reading auras and seeing spirit guides, and past lives, and things that are different than remote viewing because they are not easily susceptible to empirical verification.
It occurred to me that we should probably talk about what remote viewing is. We kind of jumped in the middle.
I
jumped in the middle.
Ourselves.
Yeah, I couldn't help
Right.
it. How would you describe remote viewing for a person who's curious but hasn't heard anything
Well,
of it?
I would say it's an updated word for what we used to call clairvoyance or clear seeing, having information about distant events just pop into your mind. Usually the way Russell does it is very simple, no particular training or anything. We go into, at SRI, a quiet room, and in fact, in that case, in the radio physics laboratory, it was a sealed room, so radio signals couldn't penetrate. There was no possibility of somebody, giving me secret information via walkie-talkie. And so I'm in the sealed room, and he says to me, close your eyes and ask your subconscious mind to give you permission to get information about the target. And in this instance, the target was a random location chosen by the outbound experimenter, Elizabeth Rauscher. She leaves the building, and when she gets into her car, she opens up an envelope that has the random target, and she drives there in a half hour. She gets there, and at that point, I'm supposed to describe the mental impressions I have that might correspond to the location and the experiences that she's having.
Wow.
Do you find that there's a gap, there's a divide between what people think these things are and then maybe what the people that are working on these actual things believe that those things are?
Well, the tricky thing is we don't really know how it works. It's, there's some people who would call it remote viewing or remote perception, as if information is coming to you from a distant location. That's sort of a information transmission model. There are other people who would say, no, it doesn't work that way at all, because there's no organ of perception and there's no channel of information being transferred. So how then does that knowledge pop into your mind? Well, some people say it's Jungian synchronicity, which we don't understand, except it's not an information transmission model. Other people would say it has to do with the nature of time and space. That time and space aren't what we think they are. And other people would say, well, everything is consciousness, that the whole world the whole universe is part of your consciousness. So the fact that you can access information from anywhere in time and space really just shows you how large your consciousness actually is. And to be honest, from a scientific point of view, we have very little evidence that favors any one of those interpretations over any other, except to say that, we don't have the information transmission model seems to be the weakest of them all.
It's like you're describing omniscience, just being able to know something.
You could call it that. You might say we are like godlings, or another way to think of it is that the boundaries that separate my mind from the rest of the world are a bit leaky. The margins are leaky, and somehow knowledge passes through those margins, that the idea that every human being is a separate world unto themselves is mostly true, but not entirely.
Yeah, I'm getting, images of, people saying that, well, we are everything, right? So then if that's true and we are everything, then maybe a moment ago I wasn't aware of my left foot, but maybe now I am. And so I can perceive something. So maybe where somebody is at a particular time and place, that is us. We're just not paying attention to it. I don't know. It's an interesting thing to think about.
Bottom line would be that everybody who participates in remote viewing comes away with a sense that being a human being is much larger than we were raised to think. We don't learn in conventional education and even in conventional religion how large our human consciousness actually is.
When I think about remote viewing, it opens up this kind of other portion of the conversation, which is, what happens after we die? Have there been interactions that you know of in the research with non-physical beings?
The tricky thing is, how do you know if you're interacting with a non-physical being
Good question.
that's actually what it is, as opposed to a projection from your own subconscious?
Right.
Or even if the non-physical being, let's say, provides you with a whole host of accurate information that you wouldn't otherwise have known, how do you know that it wasn't your own clairvoyance or remote viewing abilities, or the remote viewing abilities, if you're working with a medium or another person, of theirs? So parapsychologists have run into a kind of philosophical roadblock,
Right.
in terms of addressing the question of the existence of spirits. Shall we say, spirits of the deceased, or spirits of aliens, or any other kind of
Angels, demons,
physical
fairies, etc.
beings. But if you take a look at all of the accumulated case studies that are now, I would say, 150 years old or so. There are thousands of reports of different interactions that people have had with apparitions, with mediumistic communications, with alien abductions, with near-death experience where they encounter visions of their departed loved ones and so on. It begins to paint a picture. of another world, an invisible world, a supersensible world that is populated by autonomous conscious entities. So even though we've run into this roadblock where we can't really finalize any sort of proof at this point, or even a really strong, convincing argument, if you look at the larger picture painted by probably 1,000 different case studies, it's hard to come away without feeling that the probability that invisible beings, spirit beings, hyperspace beings, however you want to define them, very likely that they're real. I regard it as a worthy hypothesis that is yet to be firmly established.
Great. So the way you're describing it is, let's say, it's philosophical, it's scientific, it's analytical. But if we were to step into just the experiential for a moment, would you say, like, outside of the scientist self, just your experiential self, have you had experiences that you believe were fitting into that category of
Well, I had
supernatural?
one that changed my life.
Okay.
For example, back in about 1972, I had a very powerful dream in which a great uncle of mine appeared in the dream, my Uncle Harry, whom I hadn't seen maybe in 10 years or so at that point in time. And he began talking to me about my life in a very, very powerful way, so that when I woke up from the dream, I was singing an old Jewish melody. In fact, yesterday was Yom Kippur. It's a melody that's only sung in the high Jewish holidays, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. It's called Avinu Malkeinu. It's very considered sacred liturgy. And I woke up singing this song and crying at the same time, which has only happened to me once in my life. It was such a powerful emotional experience. The kind of experience that people, I would describe, and other people describe similar experiences being more real than this.
Yeah.
And so I wrote home. I asked my parents, how's Uncle Harry? I had a dream about him. And my mother phoned me up right away. She said, how did you know? Uncle Harry just died.
Wow.
And so that got my attention.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
It certainly made me think that, there is an afterlife. And of course, my experience isn't unique. Many people have had those kinds of experiences.
For sure.
So yes, at an experiential level, that experience gave me every reason to feel that there's a real existence beyond this physical plane.
And is that feeling something that originally drove you towards the study of parapsychological studies?
Yeah, for sure. It did. I began to ask people about it. I mentioned it to my professors at the time. I wasn't in graduate school then, as I recall, but I was working as a volunteer in the psychology department.
Is that Berkeley?
At Berkeley, yeah.
Okay.
So I started talking to the professors. What do you know about this? I learned very quickly that nobody at Berkeley had anything intelligent to say whatsoever. And
They would have been happy for you to just stop asking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's when I resolved that if I wanted to understand these things, I would have to become my own expert. I couldn't rely on other people. And that was sort of a very key moment in the process that led me to end up eventually creating a doctoral, individual, interdisciplinary doctoral major in parapsychology at Berkeley.
I'm curious about that.
Yeah.
Like, considering that this is not the typical thing that happens in education, me being an educator, right? Could you tell us about how did that happen?
I was in a program at Berkeley. I enrolled in criminology. Because I had a background in psychology and also some criminology as an undergraduate, and So I enrolled in criminology. I had a big interest in human deviance, and I was doing interesting work in criminology. I was working as a volunteer at San Quentin Prison in the psychiatric unit doing group therapy with murderers and sex offenders.
Wow.
So it was fascinating work, but at one point I got disillusioned, being around all that negativity. And I realized that what I really wanted to do was explore positive forms of human deviance rather than negative.
Yeah, boy, did you. Yeah.
And the problem was that at a school like Berkeley, you could study crime, you could study psychopathology, much as you wanted. There are many, many programs, but if you want to study intuition, creativity, psychic functioning, mysticism, there was nothing.
Yeah.
So I agonized about this for a long time, for months. And it was very depressing. I didn't know what to do. And then one day, I told myself with absolute certainty that today is the day I'm going to have a dream. And the answers to how I'm going to, navigate this situation is going to come to me in a dream. I knew that. Wow. And so I went to bed, and that night I did have a dream, a very vivid dream. And when I awakened from the dream, I felt certain that I had the answer, but I didn't know what it meant. So, and in my dream, I was visiting some friends in Berkeley, across town, married student housing, and I knocked on the door of their apartment. Nobody was home. And in the dream, I found the key that they hid and let myself into their apartment, walked into the living room. Sitting in the middle of the living room floor was a magazine. In the dream, it was called EYE, and I picked it up, and as I was paging through the magazine, I woke up with this feeling of exhilaration, like that's the answer. But because I had no clue what it really meant, I acted out the dream. Wow. Got up at 7 a.m, put on my tennis shoes, ran across town 5 miles to the married student housing, knocked on the door of the apartment. Nobody was there, just as I had dreamt. And actually, I knew they kept a key under the doormat. Mm-hmm. So I let myself in, walked into the living room. Sitting in the middle of the living room floor all by itself was a magazine.
Wow.
And I picked it up. The magazine wasn't called it was called Focus.
Wow.
And that magazine brought focus into my life. It was the magazine published by KQED, AM and FM and TV in the San Francisco Bay Area, listener-sponsored public media. And as I was paging through it, it dawned on me for the very first time in my life that I could pursue my interests by getting involved in that nonprofit segment of the media. And so I went over to KPFA radio in Berkeley, which was a Pacifica nonprofit station, and I just volunteered. I had my master's degree already, and I said, I'll volunteer. And they said, okay, sit at this desk, and when you hear the doorbell ring, push this buzzer and let people in the door. That's your job.
Coffee stirrer.
And I was happy to do it at that point. And it was like magic. Actually, within 3 weeks, I had learned how to produce a radio program. Wow. I did a program on basically the idea you don't have to be from out of town to be psychic, that there were all kinds of people. I was hanging out with the local Berkeley pagans and occultists. Right. And
Isaac Bonowitz.
Isaac was a friend of mine.
Oh, was he?
Oh, yeah, cool. Sure, that whole gang.
Another person who had a strange degree, a degree in magic.
That's right. That's right.
From Berkeley.
I knew Isaac very well, hung out with him all the time, and many of the people in that crowd. So I interviewed them, and that was my first radio program. And the program director, after that very first program was released, he said, we have a slot available twice a week, a program called The Mind's Ear. And within a few weeks of having the dream, I found myself sitting at a table just like this with world-class experts passing through the San Francisco area on all the topics that I was interested in, and I'm interviewing them. And people like Robert Monroe
Wow.
would come through. And that gave me then the confidence to go work through the university bureaucracy and take advantage of a very little known opportunity. If you were already in graduate school in good standing, but you wanted to do a dissertation for your doctoral degree on a topic where no single department would sponsor you, but you could find at least 3 faculty members from 3 different departments who would sponsor you to explore that topic, you could create your own individual program. And so I did that.
Wow, that's amazing.
So you had Charles Tart.
I had Charlie Tart.
And what was his degree?
See, well, he's a psychologist. He was in psychology at UC Davis, but I could draw upon the whole University of California system at that point. I had Michael Scriven in philosophy on my committee. Robert Morris was actually at the time teaching parapsychology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. I got him on the committee.
Whoa.
And I had a historian, I had a statistician, and so
Good mix.
that's how it happened.
That's how it happened. Now, when was this? About what era are we talking about?
I entered the program in 1973, and I got my degree in 1980.
Okay. Very nice.
And and Thinking Aloud, the original, was it, 86?
Yes, it was in 1986 that we launched the original Thinking Aloud television series.
Wow. And boy, you've had some great guests.
Yeah.
Oh, boy.
You definitely have, yeah.
Well, that dream that led me to do radio has been the main inspiration of my whole life in a way, because then I went into television, and then I set up the YouTube channels. So, I'm still doing the work that came out of that original inspiration.
So you're quite literally living your dream.
Yes.
Yeah.
In the altruistic sense and also in the actual sense, because it was from a dream.
Yeah.
Gosh, that is so cool.
Yeah. I felt I was being guided. Or another way, when people ask me, what is the meaning of this, that you had this dream, I tell people that if you resolve to become the best version of yourself, the universe will reach out to help you.
Beautiful. That's beautiful. Yeah.
Very nice. I love that. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I strongly believe in, we talk about these kinds of things, about how important it is to just reach in and find congruence and live from that place. And it takes a lot of courage to do that. You must have had a lot of courage at that time to trust and just jump in and go, I'm doing it.
Well, I don't know if it was courage or I began thinking about what it was. And I realized when I was in high school, let's go back even to when around the age of 16, this would have been 1962, 1963, in that area there, you were probably not even born.
Nope, 71.
73.
Okay, well, back then there was a huge fad called folk music. Folk singing. That was big. I was part of a folk singing group, as a matter of fact.
What did you play?
I played the baritone ukulele,
Nice.
and not very well.
Oliver just perked up.
Yeah, we got
suddenly. I noticed him
resident
lifting his
musicians
eyebrow
interested.
for a moment.
Yeah.
Well, it's a fun instrument for people who are not very skilled. Like I couldn't manage 6 strings, but it had only 4 strings, so I could play
sang?
the chords for some folk songs. And one of the folk songs that I just loved in that era and sang a lot and performed even as a teenager was. I don't give a damn about a greenback dollar. Spend it fast as I can. And I began to realize that somehow that, from the folk music era, I incorporated within myself this idea about not caring about conventional things like a career and money. Because, the conventional wisdom for anybody is don't go into parapsychology. Nobody will ever hire you. You'll never get a job. which is almost entirely true. Parapsychologists are some of the poorest people by and large. I've had parapsychologists, even when I was a student, try and borrow money from me.
Yeah.
Because people do it out for passion, for the most part, not for money. Anybody who is concerned about making a healthy living would never become a parapsychologist. And parapsychologists always give the advice, if you're interested in going into this field, get yourself a secure, stable position in some other area like psychology, and then become a tenured professor so you're safe and you can't be fired. And then you can kind of explore parapsychology. But I did it the opposite way. And I have no regrets, I can say that. But you have to be the kind of person who has an entrepreneurial spirit. If you expect somebody to hand you a career on a silver platter, like you might get in medicine or law or even conventional psychology, it's probably not going to happen that way. I mean, there are, maybe a dozen people who are employed full-time in parapsychology.
Wow.
In the world.
Well, with your work, you've had the opportunity to be in the physical presence of so many amazing people, interesting people. And so one question that I really wanted to ask you is everybody you meet, you get an impression. There's a physical presence to everybody. There's like kind of an energetic quality to everybody that you meet. I'm wondering which ones really stand out to you.
Well, there's one person actually who I regard as sort of head and shoulders above the others for me. And that is Jean Houston.
Oh, wow.
Who is now, Jean must be in her 80s. She's still teaching.
She's still alive. I didn't know.
Yeah. She's living up in Oregon, and not Eugene, in where they have the Shakespeare Festival.
Okay, that's
Ashland.
Ashland.
I think it's Ashland. Ashland Shakespeare Festival. Yeah, she lives. She still does workshops, and she had a big influence on me. I met her in about 1973, and I'm very impressed with her work and her talent and her vision, and she had a big influence on me, and still does. I think of her as an amazing cultural treasure.
Tell us more about what it was about her in particular that moved you.
Her sense of humor.
Okay.
And her ability to, her theatrical sense. What she did is she studied, in her career growing up, her father wrote for comedians. He was a comedy writer. And she studied theater. In fact, she studied the method acting of Stanislavski. And she also studied with Joseph Campbell,
No way.
The mythologies of the world. And she developed a synthesis of these things that she calls her mystery school, which I participated in for many years. And where she synthesized, her depth understanding of psychology. She did a lot of the original research on psychedelic drugs and altered states of consciousness, and also parapsychology. And she combined that with an incredible theatrical sense.
Wow.
And it had a big influence on me. I still think of her as... even though I haven't spoken to her in decades, I think of Jean Houston as probably the most significant external influence, a living person who influenced my approach.
Wow. And if you've gone through the mystery school, then she's your initiatrix.
Well, you could say that.
Right?
There was a point once she gave this lecture on the Kabbalah. She would choose a different topic each month. We'd meet for a weekend once a month, and this month was the Kabbalah. And she worked with Carlos Suarez's book on the cipher of Genesis. So she gave this lecture on the very first sentence in the Hebrew Bible. which is in Hebrew, Bereshit bara Adonai et hashamayim v'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heaven and earth. And she goes letter by letter through that sentence and explaining how it was that God actually created the universe using a Kabbalistic interpretation.
Zohar, right?
Well,
Is this Zohar?
from not strictly from the Zohar, but from Carlos Suarez and his book, The Cipher of Genesis.
Gotcha.
Now, he had, perhaps the Zohar was his influence. I can't say for sure. And that's another long story. We could go into Carlos Suarez and the influence that he has had on people. There's a lot to say about that. But and Jean Houston was lecturing, and while she's lecturing about this, I felt like I got it. I actually understood how God created the universe. and I thought for a moment, I thought to myself, it's the funniest thing you could imagine. And I'm rolling on the floor. and then the next moment, I would think to myself, the passion, the depth of understanding for God to create the universe, and I was crying.
Wow.
And the next moment, I'm laughing again.
Wow.
And Jean Houston saw me like this on the floor, and she walks over to me, and she said, "Oh, you're having an epiphany, huh?" Yeah. And she winked at me.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Wow.
Profound.
That is neat. Wow. Well, you know, in the short few years that we've been doing this show, we've met a lot of incredible people. And every show that every person that we interview, I feel like there's one or two nuggets that actually changes my life, that makes me be a different person, a better person, see the world in a different way. Are there any that you might share from the many people that you've had a chance to meet?
People who have
nuggets. I mean like nuggets from maybe somebody that you interviewed altered you somehow in a beautiful way, or anything that sticks in your mind.
You know, it's funny you use the word nuggets, because what I have done with the New Thinking Aloud videos is I've created a series called Video Nuggets, where I take like little 5-minute excerpts.
He remote viewed that.
Of the different videos. But actually what's occurred to me, and I used to do that even before I was doing the New Thinking Aloud series I did for a while, I was doing radio on something called the Wisdom Network. And we did nuggets there as well. And I come to the conclusion, I think, that nuggets are very nice, but they're not an adequate substitute for a more real, in-depth approach. You can get something out of a nugget, but you can get a lot more if you're willing to sit through an hour-long conversation.
Yeah.
So, I actually haven't done any of those nuggets now for quite a while.
All right.
So I guess I'm not big on nuggets.
Sure.
Yeah,
you've graduated from nuggets.
I'm going to tag team on that then.
Okay.
Because I'm going to ride on the coattails of that and ask a different question, but related.
Okay.
You've had a lot of years of reflection and experiential teachings and things like that. Yeah. And here you are at, do you mind me asking your age?
72. I'll be 73 in December.
72 and looking strong. So you could look back on your life from the very beginning when you started the show at, how old were you then?
Which show?
Thinking Aloud.
The original Thinking Aloud series started in 1986.
Okay. So I'm not mathletic, so I won't do the math on that. However old you were.
Yeah. I was 40.
You were 40. So looking back on that now, what do you now understand that if you could go back and just kind of shortcut and go straight to that thing that you've discovered? Is there anything like that you found? Or is it a lot of stuff? He laughs his ass off.
I'm sorry.
And can it fit in a breadbasket? Right.
Yes. Not a nugget, though. I don't want you to tell me about nuggets. Don't tell me about nuggets.
I don't know. You know what I think? If we were alive 10,000 years from now, we could be having this same conversation.
Absolutely.
For sure.
It's like, I can't say that I've learned anything.
Have you unlearned anything?
I don't know. It's like I live for the conversation in a way. Every moment is a nugget to a large degree, to a very large degree. But to the extent that I can say I've learned something now that I didn't know when I was 40, or I learned something at the age of 40 that I didn't know when I was 21, and I want to pass it on to you.
Or even a message to yourself back then.
Well, probably the simplest message is just be present.
Okay.
And I keep working at it. I'm not, I don't know that I'm any better at it now than I used to be, but it's important to pay attention to the here and now. Because that's where we live. We always live in the here and now. And there's so much of value if we can see it, if we can apprehend it.
Very good. That's a good nugget.
Yeah. but Carlos, I think what we learned is that they're all nuggets.
They're all nuggets. There's just so many
Put that in a
nuggets.
meme, Oliver. They're all nuggets. Yeah.
Are you familiar with the book of Abramelin?
Yes.
Yeah, so there's a new translation that came out maybe 10 years ago. That's the most complete translation, not the Victorian one that's missing like two books out of the whole.
The
but
McGregor Mathers translation. Right. I have it here.
Yeah, that one is incomplete. It's from a French manuscript, but this is actually from, I think, Middle German or High German.
Yes.
And they've identified who they think the author is. I think he was the Maharil, which is Abraham of Worms. And so just your story kind of reminded me of that. If you get a chance to get the new version of the book.
I will, because that book had a big impact on me.
Yeah, same.
When I was in criminology, in fact, because part of the magical ritual described in that book is you have to spend 6 months in total solitude.
Right. And when you read this, you'll find out it's 18 months.
18 months.
Yes.
Well, that got my attention. And one of the first things I did as a criminology student is I thought I would do a study of what are the effects of solitude.
Really?
Oh, yeah. And because I was intending when I first learned about this magical grimoire, I thought, I'm still, I was like in my early 20s. I thought, I could do this ritual. Wouldn't that be interesting?
I love you. You just went way up on the scale. I thought you couldn't get any higher, but there we go. That's awesome. That's awesome.
I looked into it. I never got even close to doing it.
It's tough.
Yeah.
It's a serious commitment.
It is. I know that Aleister Crowley endeavored to do it, and he didn't succeed either.
No.
But it's always fascinated me.
There's a fellow that has done it. His name is Aaron Leach. They're a small collection in the entire world who've actually gone through it. And he teaches and supports people in doing that if they're really serious, but only if they're really serious. Because he's a kind of an old school occultist, traditional magic with a traditional model, not a psychological model, but an actual spirit model. And it's there are no substitutions unless it's authorized within the texts and things like that. But if you're curious about his process, he teaches about that.
I will look into
Yeah,
it. Thank you for that.
Yeah,
That's
it's
very
neat.
interesting.
It's so cool that you know about that. I'm glowing right now. Just That's
Well,
pretty
when
cool.
I first came to Berkeley in 1969, I ran into a drug dealer.
In Berkeley?
I know, that's unheard of.
A guy who was dealing acid.
Even more unheard of in
It was a crazy time, a very crazy time.
He was a para-drug dealer.
He introduced me to that book. He was really into it, and I took it quite seriously.
Grady McMurtry was right there in Berkeley.
Grady,
Wasn't he?
I remember. Grady, I think he lived in Walnut Creek.
Oh, Walnut Creek. Yeah, that's right. Close by.
Yeah, the OTO.
Yeah. Yep.
That's right. Yeah.
Wait, did you know Grady McMurtry personally?
I can't say that I knew him. I believe I met him, or I believe I was at events where he was present. I have a picture in my mind of what he looks like, so I've seen him. I was probably in the same room with him on one or two occasions, but it never went beyond that.
Interesting.
But he was legendary, and
Sure.
at that time, and was involved in the publication of the original Aleister Crowley tarot deck, which I had a copy of.
That's a great deck.
Yeah.
It's so intricate.
Yes, it is.
Love it.
Yep, I was very fond of that deck. I took it quite seriously.
Yeah, yeah. And there's so much detail in Book of Thoth that he gets into with each card, and the depth of
Yeah.
of interpretation with it. It's really rich, really rich.
Mm-hmm.
So cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of books and things like that of that nature, a question I like to ask sometimes are there a couple of books that you just couldn't live without, that you just highly recommend?
Nope.
Okay. all of them, in other words.
Just keep reading, keep having conversations.
The Book of Nuggets, right?
The Book of Nuggets, totally. Okay, here's a fun one. Just
Okay.
just a little adventure and silliness here. Pat Price and Ted Sirius, celebrity deathmatch. Just kidding, but no, really. Comparing the two,
Yes.
they both seem very phenomenal, like big time examples of phenomenological.
Yes. Yeah. They both produced superb data in laboratory settings.
Could you speak a little bit about both of those? Because I know a little
They're
bit.
very
but-
different
Yes, I know.
people. Ted Sirius was an alcoholic. He did his best work when he was inebriated.
Wow.
And of course, it was psychokinesis, and in fact, the term thoughtograph
Right.
comes from that work that he did. There's now a big collection of all of the photographs he produced working with Dr. Jewel Eisenbud. It is being housed at the University of Maryland, not in I think in Baltimore, in the library. Steve Browdy arranged for all of that. Browdy was chair of the philosophy department there. Pat Price was, if I remember correctly, was the police commissioner at Burbank,
Oh, he
California.
was?
Yes.
I didn't know he was a police officer.
Yeah, commissioner.
Oh, commissioner. Okay.
I don't.
It's different.
No, yeah, I don't know think he was a police officer, but he was more of an administrator, I
Got it.
suppose. But he was also a Scientologist.
That's what I was going to ask
He
you.
got
Okay.
his training that way. I don't know how Ted Sirius developed his abilities.
So Pat Price developed his technique, if you will, from Scientology?
I assume
Okay.
that. I can't say for sure. It may well be that he had the talent before he ever got into Scientology, for all I know. But, you watched Third Eye Spy.
Right.
So
They described him as the most psychic man in the world, and that was their
at the
opinion.
time, yes. He was doing amazing work, but he was also, as reported in that documentary, in undergoing Scientology auditing. And even though he was being employed by the CIA, he was reporting to the Scientology people what was going on. And
Big no-no.
that may well have led to his demise, for all we know.
Yeah.
I mean, Russell Targ speculates on that. And
Sure.
That's all anyone can do is speculate.
Interesting. Did you witness Ted Sirius doing his thoughtography?
No,
Okay, so did you interview him?
no.
Okay.
Nor Pat Price.
Because he was in your book, so I wanted to ask you that question.
I never had any direct contact. I will say this about Ted Sirios. When I was an undergraduate in psychology at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, I graduated in 1969, and I wrote a senior honors thesis on the psychology of religious mysticism. That was already becoming my passion as an undergraduate. And I had an advisor who was a philosopher at the time, Claudia Card was her name, who was supervising me in this thesis. And my goal at those days, I was pretty skeptical. My goal was to basically say, this mysticism is some form of psychopathology, and I was going to try and explain it that way and describe it that way. And Claudia Card, my professor, had a copy of Jewel Eisenbud's book, The World of Ted Sirios, and she said, you ought to look into this. You should take this stuff seriously. Don't assume at the outset that it's all a form of psychopathology.
Wow.
Look at this book, for example.
Interesting.
So the Ted Sirios case was instrumental in getting me to broaden my own thinking.
So who was somebody? Was it Charlie Tart that brought that stuff out more into testing, and who brought him into the lab and started kind of making him sort of famous, I guess?
Sirios?
Yeah.
Well, it was Jewel Eisenbud.
Oh, it was Jewel. Okay.
He was a Denver psychiatrist, and who did pretty much all the research with Ted Sirios, and wrote the book.
If I remember correctly, he could, like a person could tell him, put an image of something, and he could put an image of that thing onto the camera, right?
Well,
just
the
with his mind.
most amazing example that I recall was, Eisenbud would have photographs of different targets, put them in sealed envelopes. As I recall, he'd wrap them in aluminum foil and put the aluminum foil inside of a paper envelope. And so you couldn't see at all what the image was on the photograph. And then he'd tell Sirios, concentrate and reproduce that image onto Polaroid film. He had a Polaroid camera. And one of the images was an old picture of a building in Denver. I recall Denver, Colorado, or somewhere, I think in Colorado. It was like an old opera house, something like that.
Okay.
And the image produced by Ted Sirios was almost an exact replica, except there were some interesting differences. Like, in one instance, I think there was a square window, and in the image produced by Sirios, the window had a rounded top, and things of that sort. So, his mind caused certain distortions, and I think, if I remember correctly, I'm not 100% certain about this, that some of the things produced in the Sirios images were of that same building, but not as it was photographed, but how it had looked in previous years.
Curious.
Yeah.
Wow.
So all of that is in Eisenbud's book, The World of Ted Sirios. If you want hardcore evidence, it's a good place to look. Now, there was an effort to debunk Sirios. It was published by a photographer in Photography magazine, where he claimed it was all fraud. And the amazing Randy used to go around saying, I can reproduce these things fraudulently.
Right.
And he could. It's possible a skillful magician can do all kinds of things.
Sure.
But Sirios was inebriated at the time when he did these things. And Eisenbud challenged Randy. He said, why don't you do it in my laboratory under the same conditions that Ted Sirios did it, which would be to be strip searched, to be placed inside of a Faraday cage so nobody could communicate signals to you inside and outside the cage, and to be inebriated.
Wow. And of course he wouldn't do it.
No,
Because Randy's pardon me to say, he's a bit of a chicken.
Yeah,
I'm going to say that.
He would not do it under those conditions, and his excuse was he didn't drink.
Right.
Oh.
Well,
There you have it.
I'm going to just sort of publicly pick a bone here. I'm taking full responsibility for everything I'm saying here. I've been annoyed with his approach to what he calls skepticism for years, because there's no respect to ideas as being possible. It's not even a consideration. So I've found his descriptions of things are typically just his own description. That he doesn't even, like, he'll talk about alchemy from his perspective rather than what it is traditionally. And I've noticed that he does this with a lot of psychic phenomenon and talking about PK and things like that.
Well, I think of Randy as sort of the Donald Trump of parapsychology.
Yeah, it's really true. Yeah. I mean, his demonstration of who's the Russian, the Soviet lady who moves things around?
Nina Kulagina.
Nina Kulagina, yeah, that's right. I don't know if that was staged or not. I have no idea. But when I saw his demonstration of him doing the same thing, I thought to myself, there are some striking dissimilarities between the film of her and what I'm seeing you do. And I would think, since you had so much time to think this up, why wouldn't it be exactly the same when you could do that? It's bizarre to me. And this go ahead, please.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, your listeners should know that just because a magician can duplicate for a naive audience something that a psychic doesn't mean that the psychic used the same tricks as the magician.
Right.
That's the first thing to be aware of. But I hear all the time from people who say, Randy's offering $1 million, and if this stuff is real, why don't you just go collect his $1 million? Until anybody gets Randy's $1 million, I'm not going to believe any of it.
Mm-hmm. But the thing is, he has it set up with his lawyers that not only is it that you have to prove that you can do these things, it has to be only in his definition. So he creates these parameters, and it's not. He says it's negotiable, but it isn't. Not only that, but he gets full rights over all the details. You have to sign an NDA. Yeah. You cannot release. So in other words, if you have your side of the story, you can't show it. So who in their right mind would agree to such terms? It's not a fair
Well, I
trial.
do know some talented people who have attempted to do that and didn't succeed. So maybe Randy is performing a useful service. I tend to think of it in a larger sense.
Sure.
Because I have been the victim, and I can tell you this, every single person I know in the field of parapsychology has felt a sense of victimization by these skeptics. They are very active on the internet, Wikipedia in particular. They are instrumental. And why is it that after nearly 40 years since I got my doctoral diploma in parapsychology, no one else in the world has ever gotten one?
Right.
These skeptics have driven parapsychology out of most universities in the out of all of the universities, really, except for one or two in the United States. England now has a strong presence of parapsychology, but they've been very effective in stopping the research and in preventing people from getting research funding. And they use the horse laugh. If you're in a bureaucracy, which universities are and government funding agencies are and foundations are, all bureaucracies, the one thing, if you're a middle-level bureaucrat doling out research money, the one thing that you don't want is have somebody laugh at you.
Sure.
Because you're doing something that seems obviously on its face foolish. Supporting, childish thinking, magical thinking, the rising tide of superstition, and the like. So they've been very effective in suppressing the field. But I come to think that they're performing a social service, actually. That the human race is only capable of absorbing and digesting so much of this at one time. And they are like the escape valve on the pressure cooker or something, from keeping things from happening too fast. in the 1970s, when I first came into the field, and Uri Geller was out there bending metal, and thousands of people around the country are bending metal, and the remote viewing research is getting published in Nature and in Science magazine, I thought, we're in the middle of a huge revolution. This is going to take
It's a
off.
renaissance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And my friend Jacques Vallée, at the time, was one of the pioneers working on the internet, which was then the ARPANET.
Okay.
And he was also involved in UFO and parapsychology research. And he said both of these things are revolutionize society. They have revolutionary potential. But now we can look back after 40 years or so, we can say, yes, the internet revolutionized culture. Parapsychology hasn't done that yet.
Right.
And there's undoubtedly the reason is because we're not ready for it as a species. The human species has a lot of maturing to do before we're going to be capable of, as a global culture, of assimilating this data. And so the skeptics, by preventing things from happening too quickly, may be performing a social service.
That's an interesting point of view.
Yeah, I appreciate that a lot. I'm an acupuncturist, and as a member of a, I guess you could say, at least in the United States, a paramedical profession. There's no deficiency of people making fun of us and giving the horse laugh, and what's interesting about it is, even when you have really good data, when there are really good studies done that really do demonstrate that something works and works well and by these parameters, and you can show it. Sometimes when you're in the field, you want to come to the rest of the world and say, yeah, but if we're all scientists here, then you have to bow down to the science. Then you learn real quickly that that's not always the case, right? Yet I really appreciate your angle on sharing that, because it helps to try to get some perspective on the frustrations that the people in the field can feel sometimes.
Well, things are changing slowly. For example, about a year ago, the American Psychologist published, which is the flagship publication of the American Psychological Association, and that association has always been hostile to parapsychology. In fact, of all professions, psychologists are the most hostile in general because they're the most threatened, I think, and the most insecure in terms of the pecking order amongst different sciences.
Right, it's true.
Where physicists are sort of at the top, and then chemists and biologists and social scientists and behavioral scientists are at the bottom, so supposedly. But the American Psychologist published a very lengthy article summarizing what are known as meta-analyses of parapsychology research. There have been maybe a dozen or more meta-analyses covering some 1,400 research studies with overwhelming statistical support. And this was all published, quietly by the American Psychological Association. It didn't make a big splash, but I think people are going to look back and see it as a milestone that now, one of the major professional associations is in effect giving its blessing to this work.
It's a big deal.
It's a big deal. Yeah. It hasn't yet had huge impact because it's not as if, all across the United States, colleges are suddenly teaching parapsychology. Right. It hasn't, or even doing research, but I think of it as an important acknowledgement. Maybe 10, 20 years from now, people will look back and say, yeah, we've known about this all along.
Right. Mm-hmm. Well, your buddy Russell Targ has that quote unquote banned TED Talk. Yeah. And he mentions a lot of studies contradicting the retort that most people give, which is, there's none of this has been scientifically verified, and it's absolutely just none of it's been duplicated outside of those situations, and he kind of refutes a lot of that stuff.
Sure.
In that,
those skeptical arguments. I guess I keep bringing up Donald Trump again, but I would say the people who are trying to claim, for example, that the current impeachment effort has no constitutional basis, that's about as strong as the arguments of skeptics against parapsychology are.
I don't know how long ago it was, but there was this, I guess, a couple, 2 or 3 maybe. I don't remember all the details. There were mentalists who tricked the system. Do you know what I'm referring to? There was some research, and maybe it was at SRI, maybe it was somewhere
Something
else.
called Project Alpha.
That's it.
That was set up by Randy. He had some young magicians go into a brand new parapsychology lab that had been set up at St. Louis, Missouri, at the American University. Peter Phillips was the physicist running the laboratory. And these kids came in and they did fake PK. They could bend spoons and so on using prestidigitation. And Randy put them up to it. And it was embarrassing because the researchers, they thought they might have had something exciting. They didn't ever publish any formal papers, but they published or they gave a research brief or something about work in progress. And after they presented this research brief, Randy revealed publicly that these people were his proteges, sent to show everybody how gullible parapsychologists are. Right. And the irony is they weren't gullible at all. They didn't make any strong claim at that point in time. They said, we're still looking into this, in effect. They didn't see it as an obvious fraud because the young magicians claimed that they weren't. They took them at their word.
And they're good at what they do.
But Randy, who's a publicity hog, just like Donald Trump,
He spun it.
He spun it, exactly, and the laboratory lost all their funding.
I'm so glad that you had all that detail, because I didn't know all that detail. And it brings to mind the idea that, when you're a magician, you study how to hack people's perceptions, and it's a specialization that maybe a scientist wouldn't have necessarily.
Right.
Their focus is laser focused in a particular way, just like a magician's focus is laser focused in a particular way, and they're different. It is possible to trick someone if you have enough freedom in your choices about what you can bring in and things like that, but Russell Targ was a magician.
Quite a number of parapsychologists were practicing magic. Russell...
And he's a professional back in the day, right?
Yeah, as a teenager he was giving professional performances. Darrell Bem is another parapsychologist skilled in magic. Lloyd Auerbach was the president of the Mentalists Association, who's a parapsychologist. So parapsychologists, many of them study magic, and many others consult with magicians when they're setting up their experiments to make sure that they're
deception-proof. Yeah. That's great. See, a lot of people don't realize this. People who are in the magic community who are poo-pooing any kind of curiosity about this stuff will say, it's easy to trick.
Well, scientists study. And you need to study the things that are pertinent to whatever it is you're trying to understand.
Yeah.
And just, a little personal thing. I dabbled in magic for a little bit. And you know why I did? Because I had felt deceived by an Indian guru.
Yeah, when you say magic, which...
I'm talking about, magic tricks.
Not the sacred magic.
Sleight of hand. That's the kind of magic I'm talking about. Right. Yeah. I'm mixing magics here a little bit. I think to quote Carlos, a small M versus a big M.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Small magic.
Capital M versus lowercase m.
But why did I do that? I did that because I had felt deceived by an Indian guru, and I wanted to understand a little bit of, what was going on there. So the reason I bring it up is because that kind of magic magic tricks, was pertinent to what it was I was trying to understand.
Sure.
And, if these other people are interested in other types of, magical traditions, things like that, well, they are kind of studying that side of the world, that side of the human experience. And you would want to be curious about that and see what there is to learn from that.
And the world is full of people who make their living by tricking other people. There's every reason to be suspicious.
Yeah, advertisers, right?
Yes.
Big
That's true.
corporations, governments.
A friend of mine who's a fellow hypnotist and a developmental coach and philosopher and really interesting fellow named James Tripp, he made an interesting point that, he blogged about this, like vlogged, I guess is the term, about magic versus science, this idea that what is science and what is magic doesn't necessarily need to overlap. Like the two of them can coexist. In other words, there's all this talk about law of attraction and things like that. If you follow through with those beliefs and you proceed in a particular way, you're going to get a result. When you get that result, do you need a scientist to tell you whether or not that was valid or not? No. On the other hand, are you going to be able to prove to a scientist that that's in fact what actually happened? Probably not, because it's a different protocol, it's a different way of looking at things. But let's just say that if we use the term that, oh, magic is bullshit. Well, what if magic is bullshit, but it's bullshit that actually works?
You're talking about magic with a big M.
With
now.
a capital M now, yeah. So the ability to produce, inexplicable or seemingly inexplicable results with your mind, with your intention, with something about who you are to attract or create those things. Because if you accept that you're a creator of your experience, then there are a host of things that are very difficult to measure.
When I started to study parapsychology, I spent a lot of time in the library at Berkeley. And they had this huge set of like a dozen books called The History of Magic and Experimental Science, written by a fellow named Thorndike back, I don't know, it was probably written in the early part of the 20th century. And he points out that all the sciences evolved out of magical thinking. You had alchemy that evolved into chemistry. You had astrology that evolved into astronomy. You had many different mystical disciplines that evolved into scientific disciplines, mathematics, geometry.
Sonics.
For example, Pythagoras, the founder of philosophy, was deeply involved in mathematics. Plato, who was a great mystic, at the portals of the academy, Plato's academy, it said, "Let none enter here who do not understand geometry." And so these disciplines have been intertwined since ancient times. And I can tell you this, because I created my own unique degree program in parapsychology, I've always defined parapsychology as a discipline that goes back to these ancient times, where the earliest magicians were creating science. I think that there's very important history to be looked at there, and if we want to understand what's going on today, it really helps to have that historical perspective, and you'll find it all over the world.
All that overlap.
Yeah.
Well, it is the study of cause and effect. I mean, science is, we want to study cause and effect. And if you go back to other times and other places, that's a type of cause and effect that should be studied, so.
And it's a big black mark, I think, when you create scientism, this belief that science, it becomes almost like a religion or a philosophy in and of itself, where you're no longer really applying the scientific method all the way through, because it becomes a belief as opposed to a way of going about something. Yeah. And
the tricky thing about your metaphor of cause and effect is it makes it sound mechanistic.
It does.
And
yes, it does.
Actually, the thing is, there's always a human being involved, and we like a scientist or a scientistic person, a person who subscribes to scientism, as you pointed out, might like to think that we are mechanisms, that we are biological machines of some sort. But I think probably human beings are not quite mechanistic, and I think the universe itself is not quite mechanistic. And one of the problems of applying the scientific method to these delicate, subtle areas of consciousness is there are always the subtleties that cannot be accounted for in the scientific method. The scientific method is very good as far as it goes. It's accomplished incredible wonders, and there are many wonders yet to come. And it's certainly a very important tool that parapsychologists use. And I subscribe to the scientific method completely, but I don't think it's the only method of inquiry.
Right. Yeah, that's well said. It is a method of inquiry, and it's sort of like, you need the right tool for the job. If I'm going to measure somebody's temperature, I need a thermometer. That's the right tool for the job, right? That's a reliable, valid instrument for that specific task. But there are other things that we want to inquire about that need very different tools, and maybe we can't even use the word tools sometimes.
Especially when the tool is you.
Yeah, exactly. Right. My mind is the instrument.
That's what it boils down to.
Yeah, it does.
Well, it gets, this brings to mind behaviorism and, applied behavioral science as it, there are dystopian directions that has gone from the 60s all the way to the present time, between electrodes being implanted in the brain to create responses in primates and possibly humans, to, government-run programs, things like that, to now very, very subtle things that they've created. I'm not just talking about Elon Musk's Neuralink, but frequencies and all the experimentation with influencing through, sound waves and so forth, and electromagnetics. I wonder how all of that's going to come to a head when the two paths of, finding ways to control what is scary to people, the unconscious urges and so forth that Freud spoke about, and the science of electrochemistry in the brain comes together. It seems like we're right at that pivotal moment where over this next couple of years or few years even, there's going to be such quantum leaps in that. Does that make sense? Like it seems like we're at a point where things could change drastically in the next
going
few
back
years.
to the 1950s, government agencies were exploring the use of psychedelic drugs for military purposes, for mind control, or what if you sprayed LSD over an enemy population? Can you then move in and take over? Things of that sort. And it can lead to all sorts of abuses, which is one reason why maybe it's a good thing to go slowly. I remember back in the 1970s, there was a French psychic, Jean-Paul Girard, who was metal bending, doing things just like Uri Geller, and attracting the attention of researchers at the Henri Poincaré Institute in Paris, big research center. And they had Girard doing experiments with fruit flies. Like, can you use your psychokinesis to modify the genetic expression of fruit flies, which is very well understood. Any undergraduate biology student will learn about that. And he found quickly that they could. You can use psychokinesis to modify genetic patterns.
Interesting.
And at that point, Walkowski shut down the research.
Wow.
And I commend him.
Wow.
I think he did the right thing because, do we really think the human race is ready for that? We have nuclear weapons, and it's very questionable that we're handling nuclear energy wisely.
Right.
At this point, we have a huge global problem about what are we going to do with all the nuclear waste we've created.
Yeah.
For example, we're not very good at running our own government right now. So it seems to me that to add these enhanced capacities to the human population at our present stage of development and maturity is a very risky thing to do.
I agree. What you're saying, though, reminds me of things like homunculi, right? And the creation of composite beasts that you read about in these alchemical texts and mythology and so forth. But here we are making chimeras right now. In China, they're making human chimpanzee genetic blends now. That's one. It was MIT published an article on that, how they're starting to do these things. It gets pretty scary. They're doing this even without us being involved. It's just at a governmental level.
Sure, because they have different ethos.
Yeah, for sure.
In China than we have in the West, and they're going to push on that. I understand they have plans to use genetic engineering on a wide scale to increase the intelligence and other capacities of their population. And it may well be that they will become, major superpower in the future if all of a sudden, after 2 or 3 generations, Chinese people who are already very smart become super smart. I mean, it could happen, and there could be a global gene race, just as we had an arms race and a race to go to the moon and the like. These things can happen, and they usually have unpredictable consequences and sometimes very scary consequences. It's hard to predict with all these new technologies coming online how the human race is going to navigate through them. But it seems to me that wisdom is ultimately required, and wisdom is very lacking. So
yes.
I think as much as I want to encourage people, and I've devoted my life to encouraging people to understand the data of parapsychology and all the interwoven related fields of consciousness studies and mysticism and so on, I'm in no rush to see humanity as a whole move forward if we can't exhibit more wisdom, if it's not done in the context of an approach towards spiritual enlightenment of some sort.
Right. Otherwise, it's bu hao, meaning not good in Mandarin Chinese.
Not good.
That's Mandarin Chinese right there.
Well done, Carlos.
Bu hao.
Hun hao.
Bu hao.
Well done. Yeah.
Tone is everything. Wow. For the listener who hasn't had a chance yet or hasn't, looked into it, a lot of your shows are available right on YouTube, and they've been posted, right? That's
www.newthinkingallowed.com. That's ALLOWED.
That's really great. Well, one of the things that I can see just through seeing you through the years is that you've always maintained what I would call kind of like a joyful curiosity that you show when you ask questions. It comes out in your like you're really truly enjoying yourself in the process. So I admire that. I admire that you've kept that, and it's still here today. I see it in you right now. There it is.
I'm glad it shows.
Yeah,
There it is.
Yeah, there's a boyish innocence to your curiosity, which I really admire that.
Well, I'll share with you one nugget then.
Ooh.
The secret to being happy.
All right.
Listen in, folks.
Lower your expectations.
Well, no,
I'm just kidding.
In a way, yes, but the secret to happiness to me is very simple. You commit to being happy. You tell yourself, I'm going to be happy no matter what.
Like a relationship.
Beautiful.
That's awesome.
Happiness is a commitment that you make to yourself.
Beautiful.
Thank you for that. It's like an arranged marriage. We'll just get married to happiness.
Not a bad way to think of it, as a matter of fact. I like that.
I'm ready for the honeymoon.
Yeah, me too. Me too. All right.
Well, thanks.
You're
Thank you
very
so
welcome.
much. Yeah, you made a dream come true today.
Good.
Thank you for that.
Yes, yes, likewise. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to The Authenticity Show with your hosts, Carlos Casados and Satch Purcell. Very special thanks to our guest today, Dr. Jeffrey Mishlove. If you'd like to check out Dr. Mishlove's show, you can go to www.newthinkingaloud.com. My name is Oliver Altine. I produce this show. I also wrote the theme music, which you're listening to right now. And the interstitial music this time was an old song of mine called The Abbot's Dream. You can find that on my album Obsidian Kite. Please subscribe to The Authenticity Show wherever you get your podcasts and find us on social media. We would love to connect with you there. And you can find our website at authenticityshow.com. Thanks for listening and have an authentic day.